Well, thank you very much. It's a great pleasure to come here back to KCL. I was a graduate student here and a postdoc, so it's very nice to come back. I'm going to be talking about an epistemological theory of causation, so a theory of the epistemology of causation called evidential pluralism. And I've been working on evidential pluralism in medicine for a few years, and I've recently started a project on evidential pluralism in the law. And this is joint work with Alexandra Trofimov, who I think is with us online. Okay, so evidential pluralism is an account of the epistemology of causality. It was originally applied to medicine. I'm interested at the moment in applying it to law. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to provide a general introduction to evidential pluralism as a specific theory, because there are a couple of other talks that touch on evidential pluralism later today, and I'll figured I'd save them a bit of time by providing an introduction to the theory. And then I'm going to look at how evidential pluralism can be applied to the law and regulation. And I'm going to look at an example that cuts across medicine and the law, and this is face mask regulations to control COVID-19. Okay, so what is evidential pluralism in medicine? The motivation behind evidential pluralism starts from this platitude that correlation isn't causation. And when we examine this platitude, try and understand why we have this platitude these days, the answer is because an observed correlation between two variables A and B might be due to one of a large number of possible factors. It may be that A is a cause of B. It may be due to reverse causation or confounding or performance bias, other sorts of bias. There's a catalogue of bias on the internet that includes, I think I counted 65 different kinds of bias. So there are many, many different possible explanations for a correlation. It could be the explanation is statistical due to chance or temporal trends amongst the variables. It could be due to a non-causal connection. So it could be due to a semantic overlap between the variables or some logical connection between the variables, for example. And this happens quite often in practice. So what picks out causation as an explanation for a correlation? Well, if A is a cause of B, then there's bound to be some complex of mechanisms that explains instances of B by invoking instances of A, and that can account for the magnitude of the observed correlation. So this gives rise to the thesis that in order to establish causation, we need to establish correlation, but also the existence of a mechanism that can account for that correlation. And this is the core intuition behind evidential pluralism. So this picture encapsulates evidential pluralism quite well, I think. At the top is the proposition we're interested in, A is a cause of B. In order to establish causation, we need to establish correlation and mechanism. This is called object pluralism, I think, by Phyllis Ilari. So there are two objects of evidence that we need to focus on. The standard way of establishing correlation, conditional on potential confounders, is to perform an association study. So this is measuring A and B together with potential confounders. That directly confirms correlation. Certain kinds of study can indirectly confirm the presence of a linking mechanism as well. So randomized controlled trials are valued because they indirectly confirm the presence of a linking mechanism by reducing the chance that the correlation is due to confounding. But we can confirm a linking mechanism much more directly by hypothesizing features of the mechanism And we can carry out studies that look for these features of the mechanism. So entities, activities, intermediary variables, and organizational features of the mechanism, and so on. So the second part of evidential pluralism is study pluralism. When assessing a causal claim, we need to consider not only association studies, but also mechanistic studies where available. Evidential pluralism also has an account of external validity. So we might establish causation in a source population using evidential pluralism. This can help confirm causation in a target population that we're interested in if we can provide evidence that the mechanisms by which causation occurs in the source population are similar enough to the mechanisms by which causation is supposed to happen in the target population. So we get a kind of boosting. This mechanistic aspect of evidential pluralism allows us to give us a nice account of extrapolation from a source population to a target population. This picture just combines the idea of appealing to studies on a source population with the previous picture that focused on association studies and mechanistic studies. So this includes extrapolation within the picture. The interesting thing about evidential pluralism is it goes against the main tenets of evidence-based medicine, standard evidence-based medicine, and evidence-based policy. And this is because evidence-based medicine de-emphasizes mechanistic studies. So it views mechanistic studies as inherently low quality and argues that you should focus on association studies where you have them, and either treat mechanistic studies as relatively uninformative or ignore them altogether. So most evidence-based medicine systematic reviews will just ignore mechanistic studies. Some evidence hierarchies, such as this one, put potential sources of high-quality evidence of mechanisms below ideas and opinions in the evidence hierarchy. And this goes against evidential pluralism because evidential pluralism treats mechanistic studies on a par with association studies. So in previous work, we've been looking at how to extend evidence-based medicine so that you can scrutinize mechanistic studies alongside association studies. So here are two open access publications. The one on the left extends evidence-based medicine to something called EBM+. The plus is considering mechanisms alongside association studies. And the one on the right looks at the application of evidential pluralism to the social sciences and seeks to extend evidence-based policy to EBP+, which considers mechanistic evidence in a systematic way. We've been interacting with the International Agency for Research on Cancer. So this is a World Health Organization body that's responsible for assessing the carcinogenicity of various chemicals and other exposures that people may face in the workplace or in their daily life. So it's reviewed about more than 1,000 substances and working exposures to see whether they're carcinogenic or not. And the procedure they use for assessing carcinogenicity now is very much in line with evidential pluralism. So they have a working group that looks at human epidemiological studies, assesses that evidence. A working group that looks at mechanistic studies, assesses that evidence. And then a third working group that looks at animal studies. And as long as the mechanisms are sufficiently similar, can use results on animal studies, extrapolate those to the human context as well. So here's one area in which evidential pluralism is kind of routinely used in the health context. Some people have recently argued that we would have been better with EBM plus during the pandemic than with EBM. And here their argument is that for some aspects of the pandemic, particularly those characterized by complexity, urgency, and threat, mechanistic evidence has been mission critical and RCTs difficult or impossible. Thousands of lives were likely lost as a result of what was incorrectly claimed to be an evidence-based approach, dismissing or downgrading mechanistic evidence, overvaluing findings from poorly designed or irrelevant RCTs, and advocating for inaction where RCT evidence was lacking. The pandemic is an epistemic opportunity for the EBM movement to come to better understand, debate, and embrace EBM+. I'm going to be looking at this claim a bit more closely later on in the talk, where I'll be looking at the face masks example, and I'll suggest that the face masks example helps to substantiate this claim. So this is an example where standard EBM downplays face masks because there isn't good RCT evidence. But if we were to do a sort of EBM plus style evaluation, we can see that face masks, at least face mask mandates, are actually effective. So, I mean, the argument here is that EBM is responsible for thousands of deaths. Had we been using EBM plus, we could be in a different position. Okay, so now I'm going to turn to evidence-based law and regulation. And this is the current project that we're working on, looking at how evidence can be used to justify laws and regulations. Evidence-based law is a fairly recent approach to the law that seeks to assess and justify laws by appeal to their effectiveness. Evidence-based law can be thought of as arising from a confluence of two streams of work. On the one hand, there's a long tradition of empirical methods in the law. This goes back to Quetelet and Géry in 1833. Each published a book advocating a kind of social scientific approach to criminology, and this led to large advances in, at least in the area of criminology. 1881, Oliver Wendell Holmes, he argued that causal generalizations can be used to justify laws. So whether laws work can be used as part of their justification. In a famous case in 1907, Brandeis used empirical arguments to justify a law limiting women's industrial labor to a maximum of 10 hours per day. And shortly after that, the legal realism movement began in earnest in the States. And this emphasizes empirical evidence over precedent and normative theorizing in the law. And then in the 1960s, the field of empirical legal studies began to emerge, and this applies social science methods routinely to the law. On the other hand, there's this stream of work from evidence-based medicine and evidence-based policy. So in the UK, the Cochrane collaboration was set up in 1993, and that has since then been conducting evidence-based medicine systematic reviews. Then the Campbell collaboration was set up shortly afterwards on the model of EBM to carry out evidence-based policy reviews. Then in 2006, some authors suggested that evidence-based law is a natural next step to use systematic methods for assessing effectiveness to justify laws and regulations. So this is the approach that we're looking at now. The question arises whether evidence-based medicine does provide a model that is appropriate for the law. And we would argue, no, at least standard evidence-based medicine isn't a very good model for evidence-based law. There's some general objections to standard evidence-based medicine, which I've touched on already. There often aren't RCTs of high enough quality to establish effectiveness. We found this in the pandemic over and over again. This leads to inconclusive results. Often the results of a systematic review that doesn't include very informative randomized controlled trials, this can be interpreted as judging an intervention to be ineffective when in fact it is judging an intervention to have not been found to have been effective. EBM, as we saw, is prone to a wide range of biases and to manipulation by drug companies and so on. It also makes successful extrapolation a mystery, so it can't give this mechanistic account of extrapolation, which is possible with evidential pluralism. But there's some problems specific to the law. So randomizing to individuals and blinding interventions is usually impossible in the law altogether. So you can't insist that an individual must abide by a law when other individuals do not have to abide by the law. It's also not possible to assign individuals a placebo law to ensure that those individuals don't know whether they're in the intervention group or the control group. And this is because the knowledge that one must abide by a law is essential for the law to be as effective, as a deterrent or a guide. And it's not possible to enforce a law that is properly blinded and randomized to individuals, because enforcers won't know who to enforce. So this rules out kind of standard RCTs in the law. An alternative is to try cluster randomization. So this is to randomize laws to regions rather than individuals. And sometimes regulations are tried out on regions, usually not randomly. But rarely can one include enough regions to reduce confounding to acceptable levels. So we're not going to get results that establish the effectiveness of laws by using cluster randomization. And blinding remains impossible. So the EBM model of looking at RCTs isn't really going to help in the law. Evidential pluralism suggests moving to an approach that might be called EBL+, which scrutinizes mechanistic studies alongside the association studies of standard evidence-based methods, and integrates this kind of assessment with that of association studies to reach an overall evaluation of the effectiveness of a law or regulation. And that's what I'm going to be looking at for the rest of the talk, this EBL+ idea. So how are we going to do this systematically? I'll go through some of the main steps that we might run through as part of a systematic evaluation of a law or regulation. First of all, what are the causal claims that are going to be of primary interest in the law? Well, we'd argue here that there's 4 kinds of claim that are especially important in the law. First of all, we need to show that there's some problem that needs to be solved by the law. So we need to show there's an existing problem whereby some activity C is a cause of some undesirable effect E. For example, in the UK, using handheld mobile phones was banned while driving because of a perceived problem that using handheld mobile phones causes road traffic accidents. We're going to use evidence-based law. We need to work out whether that really is a problem. Another case study we've looked at is fake news. Do we need regulations to tackle fake news? That depends whether fake news is a genuine problem, whether there's evidence to show that it's a genuine problem. Not altogether clear. The second kind of claim that we need to look at is the claim that the proposed law does intervene on the problematic activity as we might hope it would. For example, does a law that bans the handling of mobile phones while driving reduce the handling of mobile phones while driving? That's also not obvious and needs assessment. The main claim of interest is a benefit claim. This is the claim that the law has an effect on the undesirable outcome. So banning mobile phones while driving will reduce road traffic accidents. This is the key claim that needs assessing. And then we also need to assess any harm claims. So what side effects does the law have? Are these harmful? Do they outweigh the benefit that the law produces? For example, banning handling the mobile phones may lead to problems if you're continually playing with the dashboard to ensure your phone connects via Bluetooth and so on. So these are the 4 kinds of claim that are going to be of key interest in the law. And each of these claims can be evaluated using evidential pluralism. So the approach we're going to take is to use this picture to evaluate each of these 4 kinds of claim. So just to reiterate, there's the claim we're interested in testing. We need to establish correlation and mechanism. To establish correlation, we need to look at association studies. This can help inform whether there's some underlying mechanism, but we also need to hypothesize features of the mechanisms and look at mechanistic studies as well. And so in evidence-based law, the approach we advocate systematically carries out this sort of evaluation. Here's what the procedure looks like. Sorry, the font is a bit small here, but the first step is to specify the causal claims you're interested in. So problem claim, intervention claim, benefit claim, harm claims, what's the population, and so on. And then for each claim, first of all, we're going to assess the left-hand side of the picture, so the association studies. So we need to specify the correlation claim, formulate our specific mechanism hypotheses, search for and assess the association studies, and then try and work out whether we need a mechanistic evaluation at all. It may be the case that the association studies on their own establish the claim, and that the mechanism hypotheses that have been put forward, even if they were true, they wouldn't change the assessment that we would have produced with association studies. In that case, we don't need to progress to a mechanistic assessment, but in most cases, we will need to progress to a mechanistic assessment. Then we need to systematically search for mechanistic studies, assess those studies, and assess the specific mechanism hypotheses. So we're at this stage now, assessing the specific mechanism hypotheses. Then we can come up with a final evaluation of the correlation claim and the final evaluation of the general mechanistic claim, which is this one. The correlation must be attributable to some underlying mechanism. And we can assess the causal claim. And then finally, once we've done this for all the claims of interest, we may need to harmonize the results, because it may be that the evidence for the benefit claim, for example, also partially informs the intervention claim, and it may be that the assessment for one claim should be used to adjust the status of another claim. So that's the procedure that we're going to go through in the case of face masks. Just to say, what do I mean by the status of a claim? Here, just to be explicit, we're using 7 different possible statuses that we could attach to a claim. At best, you're going to establish the claim you're interested in. If you can't establish it, you may yet be able to provisionally establish it. Perhaps the claim is arguable or arguably true. Perhaps you've ruled out the claim or provisionally ruled out the claim, or the claim is arguably false. And if none of those is the case, then we classify the claim as being speculative. So these are kind of the the grades that we attach to the claims of interest. Okay, so now we're going to look finally at our example, and this intersects both medicine and the law. We're going to look at the effect of face mask mandates to control COVID-19. So we're going to go through the stepwise procedure to assess face mask mandates. This is interesting because just this year, there was a controversial systematic review of face masks. This found the RCT evidence to be uncompelling, and so didn't say that face masks were effective. Almost everyone interpreted that as saying face masks are ineffective at controlling respiratory diseases like COVID-19. And so we're going to look to see whether sort of EBM plus, EBL plus evaluation comes to a different conclusion, and we'll see that it does in this case. So let's have a look at the mechanism hypotheses first, so that we can get a sense of the problem. The problem here is that the prevalence of COVID-19 leads to COVID symptoms. COVID symptoms can be severe. They can lead to hospitalization and death, as we well know. So that's the problem claim that we first need to test. Then we're going to go on to the intervention claim, the benefit claim, and a harm claim. So COVID-19 leads to prevalence of COVID infections via 3 contagion mechanisms, via aerosols, droplets, and touch. And this causes COVID symptoms. Now, mask regulations are supposed to lead to mask usage via 2 hypothesized pathways. One involves enforcement of those regulations and sanctions for those who don't conform to the regulations, and that's supposed to lead to mask usage. Another pathway is attributed to the expressive nature of law. So having a regulation tells people what they ought to do, and people conform to the law because they realize they ought to do it, rather than in virtue of sanctions. Potential harm mechanism is that by putting masks on, that can make us complacent and less likely to comply with other public health measures. And so we may thereby increase the prevalence of COVID by wearing masks. That's a potential harm claim that needs to be assessed. Okay, so first let's run through the stepwise procedure for the problem claim. What's the problem claim? Well, without public health interventions, the COVID virus spreads rapidly, causing large numbers of symptomatic COVID infections. The correlation claim is that there's a large association between a lack of following public health mandates and COVID-19, the spread of COVID-19, and this association is robust when conditioning on potential confounders. The mechanism hypotheses, I've already mentioned 3 main mechanisms here: aerosols, respiratory droplets, and contamination through touch, contaminating objects, passing on the virus by means of objects. So 3 key mechanism hypotheses here. First step is to do a kind of standard EBM or EBL assessment to assess the association studies. So you go through the association studies, try and find out whether they support the correlation claim, do they support the causal claim? Is that correlation likely to be due to the presence of an underlying mechanism and therefore causation, or is it likely to be spurious and due to some kind of bias, for example? When we search for studies, association studies for the problem claim, we find all the studies strongly or more or less strongly support the correlation claim and the causal claim. So this is useful because our preliminary determination, when we screen the need for a mechanistic evaluation, is that we've got so much good data from the start of the pandemic, and the data is so conclusive that performing a mechanistic analysis would make no difference to the status of the key claims. And the association studies on their own already establish the problem claim. And this should be fairly obvious that there is a problem here that needs to be solved. It's much simpler than the case of fake news, for example. And here's one example of a situation where we don't need to progress to a mechanistic analysis. So here I'm representing this. I'm using a star to represent evidence that establishes the object that we're interested in. So the association studies here are so good that they establish both correlation and mechanism. And there's no need to assess the mechanistic studies in the case of the problem claim. It's a different story for the intervention claim. So this is, the claim here is that a legal requirement to wear face masks in public leads to the widespread and proper use of face masks. Again, we need to assess first whether there's a correlation conditional on potential confounders. And the first step to doing this is formulating specific mechanism hypotheses. And as we've seen, there are two specific mechanism hypotheses here. One is that the mandate incentivizes people to wear face masks through sanctions. And another is that the mandate provides a clear message about what everyone ought to do. And this shapes and reinforces social norms and expectations that lead to compliance. Search for the association studies. These broadly support the correlation claim and the causal claim, but much less strongly than in the case of the problem claim. So our preliminary determination is that the studies only provisionally establish the correlation claim. And one reason is they only are representative of certain geographical regions. And the status of the causal claim is even lower. It's only arguably true. And the reason is that bias and confounding haven't been properly ruled out by the association studies. So here, the specific mechanism hypotheses could have a bearing on the status of the causal claim, and we need to conduct a mechanistic evaluation. So we search for and assess mechanistic studies. We find that the mechanistic evidence strongly supports the second mechanism hypothesis. And this is the hypothesis that it's the expressive value of the law that leads to compliance. And the mechanistic evidence undermines the role of sanctions in achieving compliance here. And we'd argue that the second mechanism hypothesis is provisionally established. So we haven't gone quite so far as to say it's established, and this is because some of the studies are small and unrepresentative. And that the first mechanism hypothesis, the sanctions hypothesis, is arguably false. And this is undermined by at least one study. So then we come to our final evaluation of the intervention claim. We'd say the correlation claim is provisionally established. So the mechanistic evidence provides some further support, but not quite enough to fully establish the correlation claim. The general mechanistic claim is also provisionally established. And finally, the causal claim itself, the intervention claim, is provisionally established. So here the picture looks like association studies provide strong support for the correlation claim. You get some added support from the mechanistic hypotheses, but not enough to fully establish the correlation claim. So it's provisionally categorized as provisionally established. The association studies only weakly support the mechanism claim, but you get some pretty good support from the mechanism hypotheses and the mechanistic studies. Again, not enough to conclusively establish the mechanistic claim. So the intervention claim is classed as provisionally established rather than established. Now we move on to the benefit claim. And this is the claim that the legal requirement to face masks reduces the prevalence of symptomatic infection, so it actually leads to beneficial outcomes. Again, we follow the same procedure, so I'm not going to go through these in painful detail, but we specify the correlation claim, formulate specific mechanism hypotheses, and the key hypothesis here is that legal requirement increases face mask use, which reduces the prevalence of COVID and thus the prevalence of COVID symptoms. There's also a hypothesized counteracting mechanism that might undermine the mechanism of action. And this is that a legal requirement to wear face masks will decrease compliance with other public health measures, such as social distancing, and it will counteract the positive effect of wearing a face mask. The association studies are broadly supportive of the causal claim. And we would say that the association studies establish the correlation claim, but it's possible that some residual confounding still persists. And so the causal claim is only provisionally established. So there's some high quality association studies, but they don't suffice on their own to establish the causal claim. And indeed, systematic reviews have argued that the causal claim isn't established on the basis of association studies. So a mechanistic evaluation is needed. So we search for and assess the mechanistic studies. What we find is that these mechanistic studies support the hypothesized mechanism of action, but they undermine the hypothesized counteracting mechanism. So we would say here that the second part of the mechanism hypothesis, that using face masks leads to an overall benefit, that is established by the mechanistic studies. When we looked at the intervention claim, the first part of the mechanism hypothesis, which is that imposing a law leads to compliance, this was provisionally established. So the first part of the mechanism is provisionally established, second part is established. Overall, we would say that the mechanistic studies provisionally establish the mechanism. And the hypothesized counteracting mechanism, there's actually some pretty good evidence against that. So that is arguably false. Assess the correlation claim. This evidence that we get from mechanisms increases our confidence in the correlation claim, we would argue, to such a degree that it's unlikely that further evidence would overturn the claim. So we classify the correlation claim as established. Similarly, so let's look at the picture here. The association studies on their own establish the correlation claim. And this is supported by evidence, mechanistic evidence. Association studies only provisionally establish the mechanism claim, but we get such good evidence from mechanistic studies that we classify the mechanism claim as being established. So overall, the benefit claim is established. So this is the second example where you can get further by considering mechanistic studies alongside association studies. Association studies don't lead you to establish the claim, whereas mechanistic studies, if you consider mechanistic studies alongside them, they do. In the interest of time, I'm not going to go through the harm claim in detail, other than to say, so this is the claim that wearing face masks will increase the prevalence of symptomatic infections because it makes us less likely to comply with other public health measures. And in this case, again, we have some very good evidence that rules out this harm claim. So we've got excellent both association studies and mechanistic studies that help to rule it out. The association studies on their own don't rule out the harm claim, nor do the mechanistic studies on their own. But when you consider them together, I think the harm claim is conclusively ruled out. And then finally, the final step of the process is to harmonize the results. So what we said initially was that problem claims established, intervention claim is provisionally established, benefits established, and the harm is ruled out. But notice that we've established the benefit claim. It's plausible that the benefit has to proceed by the intervention being effective. So the intervention was only provisionally established by evidence pertinent just to that intervention claim. But when we considered a broader range of evidence, we established the benefit claim. That lends further support to the intervention claim, because if the intervention is effective, then the intervention must be intervening on face mask use. So after harmonization, our final assessment is that the problem, intervention, and benefit claims are all established and the harm claim is ruled out. So here we're getting much more than we could with the standard EBM evaluation. We are getting, we think it's possible to establish the effectiveness of face mask mandates when we consider this broader range of evidence. Okay, so evidential pluralism has been successfully applied to medicine, and we are arguing that it can provide philosophical foundations for evidence-based law. And I've gone through an example that intersects both medicine and the law. And we think that this kind of example shows that this evidential pluralism position promises to resolve controversies such as the one raging this year about the effectiveness of face mask mandates. So I'm going to close there. I'm going to thank my colleague Alexander Trofimov and the Lieberhume Trust for funding this research. Thank you.
I just want one other comment, which is, I think the reason why the NYRG found very mechanistic reasoning, at least on its own, is the poor record in some areas that it has had, and I think those are areas where, as it were, the systems, the biological systems, are extremely complicated, and our knowledge is far from complete, and we can just make educated guesses, but many of which turn out to not be actual mechanisms. And I'm thinking of Alzheimer's research, which has been going on for several decades, and only recently has got anywhere near finding the proposed mechanisms actually do anything. But that doesn't mean that situation is true across the board. I was wondering if you thoughts about that. But I wanted to say, just ask you, how do you integrate this? Of course, you're a Bayesian, objective Bayesian, famous for that. I mean, do you want to say anything about how that plays in this? I mean, is it too simplistic to say that our understanding of mechanisms should provide the priors and the evidence of association, RCTs, and the rest of it fills in the other bits in our Bayesian equation?
Great, thanks, Alexander. So two really nice questions there. The first is, surely evidence-based medicine is doing something right because it's getting away from the idea that we can just assess treatments on the basis of mechanisms, what we know about mechanisms. And we know that if we just rely on mechanisms, we do often go wrong. And I think the evidential pluralist will just agree with that, say we do often go wrong if we just rely on mechanistic evidence, because we often get misleading mechanistic evidence, just as we often get misleading association studies as well. The strength of evidential pluralism is combining the two because sources of error tend to be rather independent between association studies and mechanistic studies. So you get different kinds of error. And it's by combining the two that we get greatest value from our evidence. So the kind of the EBM plus view is we were right to move to evidence-based medicine in the 1990s because that was a significant improvement on what was going on before. But we should have moved further since the 1990s than we have done. So I'd agree with Greenhouse and so on that we should have, by the time of the pandemic, we knew about methods such as this. We should have moved on by then. And it was a mistake to become so entrenched in the methods of evidence-based medicine. The second question was about Bayesianism. I'm a big fan of Bayesianism. And I do think you can have a Bayesian analysis of what's going on here. I just think that the way evaluation is structured in these areas with expert committees lends itself more to a kind of qualitative evaluation process. And I think that certainly if we're trying to get kind of AI to come up with a preliminary evaluation on the basis of the evidence available, a Bayesian analysis would probably be very helpful there. But I think in the way that sort of drug approval committees are structured, decision-making about new laws and regulations are structured, having a Bayesian analysis would probably just cause more confusion than it would help. And I don't think you need one to carry out this sort of analysis. So I think a positive approach is feasible.
Thank you.
Thanks so much. Thanks so much for the talk. I have no problem with the overall conclusion. I think it's correct. I just wonder if this was really what was our over-reliance on RCTs and a fetishism of the randomized trial is really what was responsible for the hesitance to adopt a mask mandate. Because, I mean, maybe in my reading, it was the controversy over whether COVID was airborne, whether that was responsible for, I mean, so as I understand, it's very vulgar understanding of this thing, but the question was, is it a droplet or is it airborne? If it's droplets, then the right thing to do is wash hands and distance. And if it's airborne, then that's when we mask. And there was this existing 5 micron, a mechanistic idea, this 5 micron standard, that if it's larger than 5 microns, then it can't be airborne. And so the basis for rejecting the masking stuff was largely, at least by the WHO, based on this 5 micron standard, which was a mechanistic reasoning. Not, we don't have randomized trials, so we shouldn't do it.
Yeah, that's a good question. So did mechanistic reasoning mislead us? I don't think so there, because I think that actually there were some mechanistic studies quite early on in the pandemic. It was surprising to us that the transmission mechanism was so largely based on aerosol, but I think people did find that out quite early. I don't think that these studies were viewed as very high quality because they were lab-based mechanistic studies. So although we had the knowledge early on, I don't think we used it. And I think that was a problem. Now, I don't want to say that all the problems with the pandemic are attributable to our evaluation methodology. For sure, many problems were caused, and there's a review going on in the UK at the moment by about the government's role in causing delays to public health measures. I don't want to say it's all attributable to evidence-based medicine, but I do think that there is an element of truth in Greenhouse et al.'s claim that sticking so closely to evidence-based medicine made us feel like the only studies around towards the beginning of the pandemic were mechanistic studies. We shouldn't rely on these because these are mechanistic studies. We should wait for RCTs before we reach any conclusion. Then we get RCTs, but they were kind of not quite relevant on the wrong sort of population. And so they weren't very informative, and many people just concluded that face masks were ineffective. I think that's the problematic influence there.
So I'm going to, John, read out a question from the chat. And I'm going to do something quite naughty because I'm the chair, but I'm going to insert my own question because I think it's related. So the question from the chat is, you, John, claimed that specific mechanistic studies were not required at the stage of the problem claim, but it appears that different mechanisms would require different intervention claims. For example, if droplet mechanisms are correct, the general mask suffices, while if airborne mechanism is correct, then N95 masks are required. And I'm going to insert, like I said, my kind of related question. I wonder, in the model you describe, how much, or the way of proceeding, right, where you individuate a different causal claims, how much depends on the specificity at which those claims are specified? So if you think of an example that we all know, I think Nancy Cartwright discusses it, right, where she criticizes RCT extrapolation concerns, and she has this example where there was good evidence for social policy intervention, I believe, in India to improve the nutrition of children, which consisted of education and money. And then they tried to do the same thing in Pakistan, and it doesn't work. And the supposed reason is that in the Indian case, the buying power and the control of the household was with the mother, and in the Pakistan case, it was with the mother-in-law or something like that. And so the same thing didn't work. Now, claims like that, of course, finding things like that depend in part on, and that also is in this face mask example, the exact specificity at which you specify your various causal claims. You gave us a very generic picture of the masks, but how much is going to depend on these very specific claims as opposed to the more general claims, and how does kind of your approach deal with that?
Yeah, so these are very helpful questions. So the first one on the role of mechanistic studies in guiding our interventions, I think that's an important point that I haven't really talked about here. So here I've just been talking about evaluating interventions, but of course, a lot of our the way we devise new interventions is influenced by mechanistic reasoning and mechanistic studies as well. And I agree with the question in the chat that really we also needed to evaluate, when we're looking at the problem, we also need to evaluate these mechanisms in order to decide which interventions to test, which are the most plausible interventions. So I've more been focusing on justification rather than discovery, perhaps, but mechanisms are also vital for the process of devising interventions. And specificity, the second question was about specificity. I think that, so here with the face mask example, we've been having a very broad scope of face mask mandates in general. At the first step of the process we advocate is to specify the exact population you're interested in. And I think that's very important in this process. If we were to have focused on face masks in the US and Western Europe, there are a lot more studies carried out in the US and Western Europe. So we may have had more conclusive results earlier on if we were to have that narrow specificity. But we were interested in the broader claim with our analysis. But I didn't want to touch too much on questions of extrapolation in this example, because that adds a further layer of complication. So that's why we took the sort of broader claim. But one thing that we do want to do further on in our project is to talk more about extrapolation and how you go from one population to another.
Okay. Actually, my question was related with that, so I'm going to change it a bit. So I think that it's a clear distinction between establishing causal claims and extrapolation when you talk about evidence-based medicine plus. So for instance, we establish the causal claim in rats and we extrapolate. But in that case, it seems to me that, as you were saying now, the border is not so clear, because it's difficult. I mean, it's very difficult to have all the evidence about the same exactly population. For instance, I was thinking about the mechanistic studies about the mechanism related with the efficacy of the policy of the legal intervention in this case. So it's very difficult because this changes a lot from one to another. So of course you can have the same strategy as in evidence-based medicine plus, which I love. So you establish the causal claim in one population and you have to establish, but it's difficult to identify, as you were saying, the right level of the population, because those kinds of mechanisms may change a lot, for instance, in the same country from one to another town. So you can say something more about how you will address this kind of difficulties. Thank you for your presentation.
Yeah, thank you very much, Sal. So one thing that is perhaps slightly distinctive about evidential pluralism in comparison to some other approaches to evidence-based policy, for example, is that it does keep the focus on kind of net effect on the population as a whole, so average effect on the population as a whole that you're interested in. So some other approaches to evaluation in evidence-based policy, for example, theory-based approaches to evaluation, which you might come across, these focus much more on the specific context of the intervention and trying to understand variance in effect across contexts. I think if what you're interested in is variance in effect, then approaches like theory-based evaluation can be very helpful there. But I think before we consider variance in effect, it's often a good idea to consider kind of net effect or average effect over the population. And that's the sort of question that evidential pluralism focuses on, kind of in common with evidence-based medicine. And I think that studies carried out on some subpopulation can be informative about the general population and can tell us about net effect. And again, I think understanding some of the mechanisms can help us work out how informative the subpopulation is going to be about the general population. For example, in Far East Asia, the importance of the expressive power of the law is perhaps even more paramount over the sanction aspect of the laws. So much so that in Japan, there's a lot of debate about kind of having sort of voluntary regulations where it's just the social norms that are created by the regulations that create the effect on their own. You don't need to make them mandatory. So I think understanding some of these mechanism hypotheses help us evaluate the extent to which studies can be informative about the broader population.
Hi, Jim O'Brien from Denver, Colorado. Thank you very much. I wanted to ask a judgment question. In your presentation and your algorithms, you had assessments with 1+ or 2+, and when you were addressing whether a problem statement was true or false, or claims to interventions were true or false, you were describing them as strongly supporting, provisionally supporting, weakly supporting. Can you address how these judgments are being made in a more specific way through the literature?
Yeah, sure. So the approach that we take is broadly the one taken by the evidence-based medicine approach, which is to evaluate each study, the defects, articulate the defects of each study, and work out how informative that study is about the population as a whole. So you can look at risk of biases of individual studies and so on in order to come up with a rough idea as to how informative a particular study is. And then when the studies are brought together to assess a particular claim, whether it's correlation claim or a mechanism hypothesis, that's when you need to take interactions into account. So it's not so much the looking at each study individually and the contribution of the study individually, but taking them together to see how much they confirm a particular hypothesis. So our approach is broadly in line with the sort of standard EBM approach. As I said, we interacted quite a lot with the International Agency for Research on Cancer, which does this in a routine way when it assesses carcinogenicity. They take quite an algorithmic approach. So they, again, I've given a stepwise procedure here. They have a much more detailed stepwise procedure for their assessments. That helps to make sure that their judgments don't depend on who is actually on the committee at the time, but is more likely to be replicable across different evaluation committees. So having this very structured process helps to ensure that the judgments would be made by other committees in the same way, but our approach is maybe slightly less algorithmic in that we do want to take into account interactions between studies more, and that does leave a kind of a greater role for individual judgment to play a part, perhaps. So at the end, I talked about harmonizing the results, where because we'd had strong evidence for the benefit claim, that added further support to the intervention claim. And so we could use some of that strength of evidence to further support the intervention claim. That's one point of difference with the International Agency for Research on Cancer. So, for example, they evaluate agents independently. They're very strict about evaluating chemicals independently. And this can perhaps lead to cases in which they underestimate the importance of evidence for one chemical supporting carcinogenicity of another chemical. So we want to avoid those sorts of problems. So we're quite keen on trying to capture the interactions between the studies and the claims. I don't know if that helps very much.
I'm sorry, there was one more question, but we need to leave a little time for a break, I think. So please join me in thank you, Professor Williamson, for a great talk and a great Q&A, and we'll be back in 13 minutes.